This is Real Talk, the podcast with Devin Wieters, where we talk all things inclusion and have a little bit of fun, too. Remember to leave a 5-star review and enjoy the show.
Hello. Welcome to another episode of Real Talk. My name is Devin Wieters. Today we have the first part of a 2-part episode for you. Our guest for these next 2 episodes will be Kevin Hoffman. He is the author of Growing Up Black and White. He has a lot of great things to say about race in America, which is very timely. I was very nervous to do this conversation, admittedly, but he made me feel at ease and he answered all my questions very politely. So I hope you guys get a lot out of this, because I know I did, even though I was really nervous to do the interview. I hope you guys get a lot out of this and enjoy the first episode of this 2-part episode.
This is Real Podcast.
Hello. Welcome to another episode of Real Talk, our first one in a long time, and we are back with Kevin Hoffman. How are you today, Kevin?
Good. How you doing?
I'm doing well. Tell us about yourself, and then we'll go from there.
Okay, so as you stated, my name is Kevin Hoffman, and I grew up in Detroit, born 2 weeks after the riots in 1967. The riots began because the Black community had finally had enough of the unequal treatment that they were receiving from the predominantly white police force. So, although that was 53 years ago, we're still dealing with those same things today. So that's what I was born into. And then on top of that, I am the result of an affair between a white woman and black man. So I'm a biracial person born into the city of Detroit that has a very unique racial history. And probably the most impactful point of that history was in August 1967, 2 weeks before I was born. So that's where my story starts. For obvious reasons, my biological mother and her white husband insisted that I be put up for adoption, and I was adopted by a white minister, his wife, and I have 2 brothers and a sister who are biological to my adoptive parents.
Yeah, that must have been interesting. Talk about that whole dynamic of you, being born into that and that and stuff like that. That must have been really interesting.
Yeah, it was. It was, like I said, so my adoptive father at the time was a Lutheran minister at St. Paul's Lutheran Church in Dearborn, Michigan, which is a suburb of Detroit. So they lived in Dearborn when I came home at 3 months. About 8 months after that, we woke up to a cross burning on our front yard.
How did that feel to wake up to?
Well, I was only, 8, 9 months old, or 9, 10 months old. I don't remember it, but my parents have kind of told me how it went. And yeah, it was very scary for my mother to wake up. And my mother is very nearsighted, so she doesn't see well without her glasses. And she said, I just remember hearing someone in the front yard. We had the house that we lived in Dearborn was this beautiful, big 2-story house that had a large plantation style porch. So it was a porch that kind of wrapped around the house. And my mother said, I heard voices in the front yard in the middle of the night. And I looked out the window and she said, I could tell something was on fire, but I didn't grab my glasses, so I couldn't tell what was on fire. And she said, I just assumed it was the porch. She thought the house was burning and she could hear voices out there. So she knew someone had said it, but she wasn't sure totally what was going on. And so she ran downstairs, and that's where she went to the front door and looked out and saw this cross that was about 6 foot high burning in the front yard.
Yeah, that must have been super scary. Were any of your brothers or sisters old enough to know what was going on?
Just my parents. So we're all 4 kids. We're within 5 years of each other. So my sister was in kindergarten at the time, and she doesn't remember it at all. And she's the old, so none of us really remember it.
Well, I mean, it's horrible what happened, but I guess you were sort of kind of lucky that you were young enough not to remember it, I guess.
Yeah, and that was when, too, my parents I didn't even know that story till I was in my 40s. So I was unaware that anything like that had happened.
When they told you, like, at first, like, how did you react?
It pretty much is how, when I tell that story, I get pretty much the same reaction from most people, which is just shock. Because most people think, we're done with that kind of thing. But we're not. Yeah, I mean, it was 53 short years ago. And so, yeah, I was shocked when my parents shared that with me, and kind of impressed that they kind of shielded me from that.
So did they, like, you don't have to say, like, their name or anything, but did they ever, like, figure out who did it, or?
Now, my mother, when she told me the story, I do remember we lived next to this beautiful house, but we lived right next door to an apartment complex. And my mother said, the cross had been burning for some time in the yard. And she said this young white man came out of the apartment complex, walked across the yard, and just kicked the cross down and stomped it out, and then turned around and walked back in the apartment like, it was just an everyday thing to do. So, yeah, very shocking. And the crazy thing is we're not sure. We never found out who it was. The police really had no interest in finding out who it was. And we're not sure if that was someone from the community or someone from the church where my father worked, or both. I mean, we had a hard time with the church. They did not want me as part of their congregation.
That's great. Like, our pastor just, like, preached a message on that. That's crazy that they didn't. And, like, what year was this? 1907? What year was this?
1967.
Yeah, but I can understand it sort of based on the time, but yeah, that's so crazy. Your book, Growing Up Black and White, talks about your journey to find your racial identity. What lessons have you learned from growing up in such a unique family?
Probably the biggest one I've learned was just the need for me to be around people like me. So we lived in Dearborn for 3 years. And during that time, the head pastor at the church, who my father worked for, and the board, who handled the hiring and firing of the pastors, they had tried to fire my father because he brought me into the church. And so we stayed in that community for 3 years. All the while, they were trying to fire my father for being in the church.
Did you know any of this was going on while it was happening, or did you find?
No. Until I started writing the book, I didn't know most of this about what was going on around me.
That's crazy.
Yeah, and so we stayed in that church and in that community for the first 3 years of my life, and all the while, the women in the church would refer to me as the snotty-nosed black kid in the nursery. There were several businesses that would refuse to service my mother. She tried to get her hair cut once, and the hairdresser refused to cut her hair because I was with her. There was a time we went to get family pictures at the local department store, and the woman who was taking the pictures turned to my mom and pointed at me and said, "Do you want the welfare baby in the picture?"
They called you a welfare? What the?
So that was kind of the environment that we were living in Dearborn. And after dealing with that for 3 years, my mother and father decided that this community was going to change us before we change it. And so they decided to move to the neighboring city, Detroit. My father took a call to pastor a church in Detroit on the Northwest side. And where we lived, the house that the church owned was in a Black neighborhood. So from age 3 to 18, I was always around kids that looked like me. And that was the most transformative thing for me throughout my life, was just to be around kids who could teach me what Black was. I didn't have to rely on 70s TV to show me what Black was. And that was life-changing.
Yeah, that must have been like a relief for you to not be in that environment anymore.
Yeah, and just to be around kids that I just wanted to be like all my Black friends. And so, yeah, I just wanted to grow up and be like them, which was great. They were great role models to me. So much so that I remember at probably 6 or 7, I felt bad for my white brothers and sister because they weren't Black, which was an interesting, I mean, when you talk about identity, that's a pretty positive identity.
That's interesting. That's the opposite of what we deal with today in many ways. You talk about finding your purpose. What do you believe is your purpose in life?
Well, I think it really is, part of the story that I found out later on, actually, after I wrote the book, I searched for and found my biological mother and met an aunt who shared with me that my mother actually came to my Aunt Nancy asking for money for an abortion. And my aunt gave her the money. And so my mother had every intention of leaving her sister's house, which was in a suburb of Detroit, and travel from that suburb to Flint, Michigan, which was about an hour away. And somewhere in between that hour, while she traveled, to go to the abortion clinic, she changed her mind and decided to go back home, share with her white husband that she was pregnant by a Black man and that she was going to have me. And the only caveat to that was that she would have to put me up for adoption immediately.
Now, was that like something she wanted to do or something like she felt like she had to do?
I never met her, so I don't know what she was thinking. I just know her intention was to take this money she borrowed from her sister and have me aborted. And for whatever reason, she changed her mind. And you have to understand that back in the late 60s, when a white woman was pregnant by a Black man, that was a scandal. And for her to be married, her husband could have responded in a number of different ways. Violently could have been one of them, and there wouldn't have been many repercussions for him because that's just how things were back then. And so she risked her own life and well-being by going home and sharing with her husband that she had an affair. And not only did she have an affair, she had an affair with a Black man. And so my purpose comes from all that there's something in me that feels the need to try to work and reconcile the races that I'm made up of. And so I spend a lot of my time now working with schools, universities, and organizations in the area of diversity and inclusion.
How has that experience been? Can you tell us about that?
It's been great because I use a lot of the stories about growing up, how I did. And that's been, I joke, but it's true. I often say it's great because it's great therapy that I get paid for. So I get to talk about all this stuff, which helps me kind of reconcile it in my head. And so that's been great, and it's been received well. It's interesting when you're in the field of diversity and inclusion. There's many that believe, especially if you're a person of color, there's many people that believe you're just going to come in and just tell them why they're racist. And so many people get very uncomfortable about talking about diversity and inclusion. And one thing that helps me is the simple fact that I grew up in a white home and my parents are white, and that seems to sit better with some people. And so it gives me this avenue to talk to some people who might not listen otherwise.
Yeah, that's great. You were adopted. Have you ever met your biological family? I know you said you found your mother, but have you met like any other people?
So I found my mother back in 2009. Yeah, right after I wrote the book. And it was interesting. So I used someone on Facebook to help me find my mother. She found my mother within 20 minutes. And all the phone numbers that I had and what I was really interested in was finding siblings, because I knew she had 3 boys and a girl before me. And so in the fall of 2009, I started looking for siblings. And when I found my mother, I had also found out that she died in 2003. And so I was trying to find my siblings, and every phone number I had, every address I had was wrong. And the last phone number that I tried was my mother's home number, which was also her husband's home. And so I called it, really not expecting anyone to answer. And within 2 or 3 rings, his name is Louis. Louis answered the phone, my biological mother's husband. And he was the one who actually put me in touch with my biological sister, who had been looking for me, which shocked me because I didn't think they even knew about me.
Yeah, how was it meeting her for the first time?
Oh, I just remember. So my sister, at that time, she lived up in the Detroit area. I live in Toledo, Ohio, which is 60 miles south of Detroit. But my sister I live in Toledo. My sister married a guy from Toledo. So all his family live in the Toledo area. So I got in touch with her the Monday before Thanksgiving in 2009. And she was going to be traveling down to see her in-laws 3 days after that for Thanksgiving. And she was literally going to be going right by my house. And so on Thanksgiving 2009, I sat there. My stomach was in knots. I almost called the meeting off several times because I was just kind of freaking out. But she came, and it was the first time I got to see pictures of my biological mother. Got to see where I get my smile from in my eyes. And then probably the most important part of that meeting was I got to hear what life was like for my sister growing up in that household. And a lot of times as adoptees, we always wonder, man, why couldn't I live with them? Why couldn't I live with my biological mother? That was all answered when I talked to my sister in Thanksgiving 2009, because it was a very tense environment to grow up in. So much so that when my sister was 14, she left the house.
Wow.
So, yeah, there was a lot of tension between my biological mother and her husband.
Do you think like the affair or whatever had something to do with that?
I'm not sure. I just know before I came along, so I have a brother who has since passed, but I have a brother who's 14 years older than me. So it was my mother's first child. And she had that child when she was in high school. And so her mother helped her with the pregnancy. Her mother helped her kind of raise that child. But the one piece of advice that my biological mother, my grandmother, gave my mother was, you need to attach your train to the next person that comes along, because this was in the 50s, the 1950s, nobody wants to marry a woman who has a child. And so my mother did what her mother told her to do. She married Louis, who was the next guy that came along. And what I've been told is that he never let my mother forget the great charitable act that he did to take her and this child that wasn't his into the house. But he treated that child horribly. So that child grew up and became a drug addict and an alcoholic, which eventually killed him. And that was a result of the treatment that he had received at the hands of his, I guess, stepfather. And so at that meeting with my sister in 2009, it was very obvious to me that the right decision was made for me as far as me being adopted. And I don't say that for every person who's adopted, but for my case, the right decision was made because I would have ended up just like my older brother, if not worse.
Yeah, because do you still keep in touch with your biological family today?
Not really. I met a sister, an aunt and uncle, a bunch of other people. I couldn't even tell you who they are. They all came out of the woodwork on Facebook, excited to kind of meet this. Most of them had not known about me. And so the fact that their grandmother, who they had all grown up, and their aunt, who they had all grown up to see a certain way, then when they found out she had an affair with a Black woman, that became such a juicy piece for everybody that I became like a novelty to everybody. And so all these people were reaching out to me on Facebook to connect with me because they just wanted to see who this child was that was the result of this salacious affair between their grandmother or aunt.
Yeah, like how did that feel to like have like people coming out of the woodwork all of a sudden?
Initially it was great, but then after a while, like you feel like a zoo animal where people are just coming to look at you.
Yeah, that must have been, yeah.
Yeah, it was really tough to take after a while, and to the point where I decided, which was, I tell adoptees this all the time, that whole search and reunion, that's the first time we get to call the shots. And so I decided that it wasn't healthy for me to be in relationship with all these people because I just felt like I was kind of being taken advantage of. And so I cut a lot of those relationships off because it just wasn't healthy for me at that time. I was still in touch with a niece, my brother's daughter, and she's kind of the hub of that family. And so when I need to know something or need to get in contact with the family, I'll go through her.
You've been listening to Real Talk the podcast. Connect with us on Instagram at Real Talk Pod Official, Twitter at Devin Real Talk, and Facebook at Real Talk Podcast Official. If you'd like to support the show, you can do that by using the link in the show notes. Stay tuned for the next episode.